Dr. John Fike. He works for Virginia Tech University. Dr. Fike received his master's degree in forage agronomy from Virginia Tech and his PhD degree from University of Florida. He's a professor and an extension specialist, and his program focuses on grassland production management, and he's engaged in several efforts to develop new information and educational activities related to animal production, forage production, animal welfare, and ecosystem benefits, including on silvopasture systems, which is what he's going to be talking about today. So his talk is going to focus more on a general overview of the establishment and management to some extent for silvopasture production systems. So without further ado, Dr. Fike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Liliane. I just thinking here, I'm not 100% sure that I have hit the objectives exactly like I should have. And I also hope that I don't step on Bruno's toes or get in his lane too much. But I wanted to give some kind of overview of silvopasture systems. I'm going to give just a little bit of history how I got engaged with this practice, and I'll give some definition and historical context. And then I want to spend a bit of time talking about the resources in these systems and some of our research results, and then kind of how producers are approaching some of this. So without further ado, I was engaged with silvopasture about 20 years ago when this guy on the left, Jim Berger, came to me and said, "Hey, Fike, I've got this project. We got these little young trees out here in the system, and we're doing this agroforestry practice called silvopasture, and I need somebody to do some forages work in there. Would you be interested?" And I, as a kid off the farm, in my head immediately said, "Nobody wants trees and pastures." As a young scientist who needed something to do, I said, "Sure." And so I got engaged with that, and it's been an interesting ride. Now, part of my perspective is clouded by the fact that a lot of people think about cows in the woods as silvopasture. They get that confused. Silvopasture is not cows in the woods, and it's not a lone tree in a pasture. So, try to set our boundaries here in terms of defining what silvopasture is. It's a sustainable land management practice that's integrating intensive animal husbandry, silviculture, and forage management, where the trees can provide some kind of long-term return and the livestock grazing can generate an annual income. And in some circles, we talk about this in context of a 4I principle. So we're doing this intentionally. We're not just dumping cows in the woods with a boundary. It's integrated. So I'm thinking about how do trees and livestock, how can I manage those together? It's intensive. And if there's one fundamental piece that applies to silvopasture systems, whether you're in Vermont or Virginia or in Brazil or other places, if it's going to be done well, you have to apply management. And then, how do these pieces interact? So one of my conceptions, again, nobody wants trees and pastures, but, what's my conception based on? It's based on being able to go to the local feed and seed store and buy fence posts and supplements and nitrogen fertilizer and whatever else. But these systems probably were pretty common, or somewhat common, at least in the Appalachian region, prior to those kinds of markets and changes in our economy. And why would that be? I mean, if I had a tree that could put nitrogen into the system and support the understory forage, it provided shade, kept my livestock comfortable, and it might be a source of fuel or posts, building materials, something like a black locust tree. That would be fantastic. Or, black walnuts, something that could provide feed resource for the family or for pigs or whatever. So these systems aren't new. We just kind of marched away from them as our economy and other opportunities for building systems changed. And there's some early literature that shows greater productivity with forages under different tree species. And this is some data out of the 50s, out of Arkansas, and they were looking at animal performance and saw that cows had better gain under natural shade. Calves, shade source didn't really matter that much, but calves gained more when they had a source of shade. And one of the interesting pieces here is that it's not so much, you know, more grazing time, it's changes in behavior. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. So when we think about these systems, we need to think about what are the resources and how do we manage that? Because that's what this is all about. It's managing resources. Well, you've got light, moisture, soil nutrients, opportunity for nutrient returns. And if you look at the picture on the right, you'll see temporal partitioning. So sometimes one thing is growing when something else is not. And the tree may have access to deeper soil nutrients than the grass can get to. That term exclusive access probably means really something like excluding access, where the tree can prevent the grass root from getting to those nutrients. So there's some of those kinds of dynamics that go on in these systems as well. And how do we manage that? One of the other features that, that's inherent in these systems is that there can be competition. And I sort of alluded to that with the previous slide. So as an academic, I got to throw a little jargon at you. So thinking about competitive partitioning, that's where you've got two crops that are competing for the same resources. But the interesting thing is that when I've got these different crops competing for these resources, the use efficiency can go up, and it will be greater than if I just have a single species. And so again, in a silvopastoral context, I'm trying to manage the competitive interactions so that even if I have some negative effects, from one species to the other, across the whole, I've got a more productive system. And that's really, I think that we can do better than that. And I'll show you some of our data that would suggest that. So I want to kind of hit one comment or concept called land equivalency ratio. And so if you look at the system, the light blue bars are forages and the dark blue bars are cattle. I didn't put one in here for trees in an open system, but you could imagine having a forested system, plantation forest as well. And so in an open system where I don't have trees, I can get 100% of my forage yield, is going to give me 100% of my cattle yield. And so that land equivalency ratio is 100%, or we just say it's 1. If I put a silvopasture in, I might take 20 or even more % reduction in forage yield. Doesn't sound too good, does it? Well, but maybe I lose a little bit of cattle, and that's not too good, right? But I'm 90% on this graphic. And I can't get 100% of the trees. I didn't plant this wall-to-wall trees, but when I put those pieces together, I've got a tree crop in addition to a cattle crop. And so the land equivalency ratio in this example is 1.2 or 120%. So it's more than what I would get with just trees or just cattle alone. And then the question gets to be, is it worth making these kind of management adjustments to be able to do all that? There are some data, this land equivalency ratio, or over yielding is another way to describe it. People look at forage yield response when I start integrating trees. And sometimes if I'm based on forages, I can get 50% more yield. If it's based on livestock, maybe about 40% more yield. So 1.4 LER. And this is some work that was done by a former student of mine, looking across the literature. And that's what the literature tells us. We integrate trees with pasture systems, we can get greater productivity than we've just the pasture system on its own. So again, thinking about resources. First one would, most people would think about would be light. And with cool season forages, the leaves are light saturated on an individual leaf basis at probably 50% full sun. So when you put that in a canopy, they need more sunlight. Light saturation is probably in the 60 to 70% full sun range. That means there's extra light that's not going to be utilized by just the forage stand. So if I can grow trees in combination with that, that's a good thing. Another thing, when you put a tree into the system, that light doesn't just impinge directly from the sun to the canopy. It's going to bounce around through the tree leaves, and as that bounces around and changes direction, that creates diffuse light, and that diffuse light is absorbed or used with greater efficiency. And then there's, again, the quality and the quantity and the timing of light that's affected by the types of trees that you have. So I put up these fancy tree cartoons to give you an estimate, an idea of like a pine or a something like a maple or an oak in the middle, or maybe something like a walnut on the right, which has a kind of a more open canopy, may have more compound leaves that allow more light in. And in my context, we often talk about cool season and warm season grasses. We can also get trees that act sort of like a warm season tree in the sense in that they don't leaf out until later, and they might drop leaves earlier. So if you consider the yellow line, the warm season tree, if I've integrated that type of tree into the system, I can reduce the competition for light early in the season when the cool season grasses are growing rapidly. And then I can drop off those leaves in the fall when those cool season grasses are picking up production again. So I can try to find ways to complement trees and forages. Now, this is for South Carolina. You may not want to fool with hardwood trees. So we have to think about different dynamics for managing, say, something with pine. I want to show you, again, sort of our cool season forage yield response to shade. This is some work that was done in Virginia. So again, a little different environment. And we were looking at complex mixtures of cool season forages. And what you'll see, the top line on the left figure shows the production in 2016. So that this is annual, that's not annual forages, that's just over the entire year. And the second line is 2015. So these were newly established, and we imposed different shade treatments. And what you find is in this kind of general region of 30 to 40% shade, we have higher productivity or similar productivity to a spot with no shade. And what was interesting, if you look on the right graphic, you can see that this in a new planting at that open shade, or excuse me, no shade open sun site, about 70% of the composition there was in weeds. So actually having shade actually benefited the establishment of these forages in year one. So there's some real potential value in having shade in the system for the forages. We did some looking at soil temperature in some of the early studies that we did with trees. And what you'll find is that when you have sort of moderate level of shade, you cool that environment down. And if you look at there are three lines here. The red top line is the low shade environment, and you can see the soil temperatures are highest there. And then you have kind of a green, it's a little bit harder to see. Soil temperatures are lower under that highest level of shade, which, okay, that seems sensible. And then the pink line represents kind of what's optimal or ideal for cool season forages. Just as an example, for some of the benefit here, Buren Lanier is over in the Wilmington area, has a pine-based silvopasture. He has changed his forage base to, I think, Bahia grass at this point in that silvopasture, but historically he grew fescue, and he said, I could not grow fescue in this environment without those trees. It's just a function of the trees buffering the system. A lot of people say, what about moisture? I said, well, the data kind of depend. It kind of depends on the environmental conditions. If you have a really dry period, if it's excessive, the tree and the grass may be competing. But if it's moderately dry, oftentimes the trees will help keep moisture in the system by shading and reducing evapotranspiration. So it's kind of an it depends scenario. And that's also dependent on species and that sort of thing. So, so, okay, this is all well and good, Fike, but what's it mean productivity-wise? These trees from this study in 2002, when it was extremely dry, they were 7 years old. In 2003, we had an extremely wet year. And you can see the size of these are kind of young honey locust trees. We were looking at different tree density and slope position. And what we found was with honey locust and black walnut, 2-year average, we had about 15 to 16% greater forage production under those kind of moderately spaced trees. So, that was really what got me intrigued by these systems. And well, we can increase productivity of the understory forage. That's fantastic. Well, let's jump ahead to, whatever this was, let's say 2020 or something. These are, at this point, about 19-year-old honey locust trees on your left and black walnut on your right. So the trees are much larger. They're casting much more shade. They're competing for more nutrients and that sort of thing. And what we found is this is an average of 3 years of study, or actually, it's not an average, it shows you 3 years of study. The black walnut bars in the black had lower forage production. Systems with honey locust had equal production or even a little bit greater. So those trees were not as large. They may actually be putting other nutrients back into the system. So it's a benefit for the forage understory with the honey locust trees. So I said, well, that's terrible. You lost out on that black walnut. And maybe we'll get to that. We do see changes in forage composition under these trees, and with the black walnut, it's not all milk and cookies, as it were. It's not all beautiful, but we do see some reduction in tall fescue, which it would be infected, and we do see some increase in bluegrass, which is highly nutritious. But you say, well, you tanked your red clover, but these are some of the things that are going to happen in these systems over time. Now, what does that mean for animal performance? If you look across the systems, we have to lower the stocking rate for that lower forage amount in the black walnut systems. And what we see is that average daily gain across time is as good or better in those kind of equalized, they're kind of equalized by available forage. And we look at total animal output for all of these systems, and these are summer grazing studies. We see total output is comparable across these 3 different systems. And what's going on there? I like to use the analogy, if I were giving you a buffet and I said you can have 100% of the all-you-can-eat buffet outside in the full sun when it's 90 degrees, or I'll give you 70% of the all-you-can-eat buffet, but you can eat inside, where do you think you're going to choose to go? And in which set of conditions or environments do you think you're more likely to gain weight? So what happens is those animals that have access to shade are going to utilize it. You see the black and the yellow dots, much greater shade utilization. There's a little bit of shade that comes into the open pasture system. The black walnut animals did graze a little bit more because forages are a little bit more limiting. But what's really interesting here is that those animals, like those earlier studies, they're changing their time budget. They spend more time resting. They're lying down more, they're standing less, and that spares energy. And we also have data that shows, animals that are on these silvopastures. If you look at the graph on the right, the top line is body temperature through the day of animals on open systems, and they're much warmer through the day. That's let's say we'll call that about 1.5 degrees or more of centigrade. So 2 or 3 degrees or more warmer, hotter than the animals in the silvopasture systems. And the lower table is a little hard to see, but we're measuring cortisol in those animals as well. And the animals that are out in the silvopastures have lower cortisol levels, meaning they're less stressed. And if you've got tall fescue, shade is critical for animals in those systems. And this is just a picture of animals that were on non-toxic fescue versus toxic fescue on a mild summer day, probably low 80s in Virginia. And our animals, so we're spending a lot of time on environmental issues, trying to keep cattle out of streams. And I think it's really driven by animals consuming toxic fescue. So these are data from Missouri that point to the value of shade for cattle. And it's very interesting. If you look at the first 2 lines, you've got infected fescue without shade or with shade. And to go from no shade to shade, they put pregnant animals out on these systems. You went from 38% calving to 88% calving. That's not changing the toxins. That's just providing respite, relief from the heat for those cattle. And you say, well, this isn't real world, Fike. I said, well, this is correct. This is a research study, but this points to what our producers do. They let their cattle have access to streams or woodlands. They get shade and they have higher reproductive performance. What's really intriguing to me is that the calf crop is greater with adding shade on toxic fescue than it is on just having cows on non-toxic fescue with no shade. And of course, when you look at calf performance, as you add shade into these systems and move to non-toxic fescue, you get a greater calf performance. So, this is placing us. We're in Virginia, in blue outline here. You're down in South Carolina, most of you. I keep telling people South Carolina is coming to us. These are what we're seeing in terms of changes in climate patterns or temperatures. And if you, this is Climate Central did some analysis, and parts of Virginia have 30 to 60 more growing days in our neck of the woods since 1970. There's some estimates, there's some models out there that say where we're coming from Charleston. This is Charleston, West Virginia. I was giving this talk to some people a while back. In 60 years, it might feel like you live in Mississippi, or I guess this is Alabama in this case. So if we don't address these issues, we're going to have some real challenges. The question gets back to, do people want trees in pastures? And I would argue that, yeah, maybe not, but many of them want shade. And I would argue that planting trees that can appreciate in value would be far better than spending a lot of money on portable shade systems that are quite expensive and are going to depreciate. So I'm going to show you a few examples of what producers are doing in Virginia and their motivations. So this farmer in the middle is thinning individual trees to create silvopasture, and he's largely doing it for heat stress abatement as well as timber management. This is another producer's approach. He cut out wide wide alleys out of an existing pine stand, and then got that cleaned up and got his fescue stand in between there, and said his cattle do quite well in that environment during the summertime. So this is kind of southern Piedmont. This guy did some thinning of hardwood stands, and I call it a successful failure because you can see the trees he over thinned, and they've experienced some stress, and you can see that in this picture. But then he went back another time and worked with a consulting forester, conducted a successful timber sale, and has gotten some greater management in this place to establish silvopasture. Many of you may have people who have access to pine plantations. This is a former student who created his own silvopasture. He didn't have a lot of money, so what he would do is go in and do select thinning on his own. He had portable fencing systems. He would put goats in there. They were eating the invasives that were in that pine stand. He broadcast seed and would use strategic use of fire, and was getting a forage understory underneath that. And because he had the opportunity for sort of long rotations, he never had parasite issues or that sort of thing. And so he's looking at this from a production standpoint, from an environmental restoration standpoint, and of course he liked it as part of his fitness plan. Buck Holsinger is up in the Valley of Virginia, and he's planted with tubes, and he says, I'm looking for two-story agriculture. I was listening to Buck talk earlier this week. He said, I used to think I was a grass farmer. I thought I was a cow farmer. Then I thought I was a grass farmer. He said, now I think I'm a tree farmer, and I'm using the trees to protect and buffer the forages, and also to protect and buffer the cattle. And, from a marketing perspective, he says, my customers get it, because he's direct selling his stuff. And I think I have some other pictures from his place in just a little bit. Well, here's one. This is how Buck approached. He's got an odd piece of ground. He said, I sat down at a table with Farm Map, and I just started thinking, what will I do with this? How will I put these in place? And he started laying it out. And then he came back and said what trees he wanted. And this is the map that he gave to the custom contractors who put the system in place for him. Mr. Milton Napier here on your left, the top left picture, He's been doing this because he's thinking about this as a second career and an opportunity for intergenerational land transfer. He's trying to improve the value of his land to pass on to his heirs. Other people have more resources, and think about this is something to do for hunting or for beef. This is a twin row loblolly pine system in Southern Virginia. Others are all about the aesthetics. I've had one producer tell me that he rents some property on or rents some housing on his property. And he says, I'm sure that I get higher rental rates for that just because of the beauty of the silvopastures that they drive past. Others people are going to be looking for something different. And this engineer was one of those. This is some of how he laid it out and some of what's going on his site now. Black locusts have done quite well. Again, he's a little, we have fewer people probably working with hardwoods, but there are more and more of them that are doing that. Species diversity, community engagement, wetland protection for Dana Beagle here, somebody in Southwest Virginia. I want to throw out an idea. While a lot of the work that I'm doing is trying to get people to plant trees and systems and manage for that, I wanted to throw out an idea about reclamation. One of my colleagues says silvopasture is a gateway drug in that I can get people engaged with silvopasture, and then they can start thinking about forest management. This is a site from New York. The extension forester is a guy named Brett Chedzoy. He has silvopastures in New York on his home family farm and in Argentina on his wife's farm there. What Brett did is this is what our farm looked like in 2004. So if you've got people that you work with, or if you've got land you have access to that's full of invasive species, and there's a lot of questions about what about regeneration in these systems. You have cattle introduced into these systems, that's going to be a problem. Look, there's no regeneration here that's of any value, right? Let's be honest about that. It's full of invasive species. So, this is Brett's comment. Keep the livestock out of the woods so they don't eat the regeneration. Really? Come on. So, what he did was he brought in a forest mulcher and cleaned out a bunch of the junk and got seed back into the environment and brought his cattle back in. And at this point, this was 4 years after he did that, he had a lot of black locust trees and maybe some other species as well. The black locusts are quite valuable to him as, a pole or post crop that he can sell. And this is another image. Sorry about that. Adjacent plantation, head high with invasives before he started grazing. So we can use animals as tools. We can use other tools to clean up some of these sites that are degraded and make better value from them. Now, probably the kind of last piece I should really speak to here, and I said this earlier, the one fundamental piece about silvopastures, because it's very difficult to be prescriptive because of the different environments, the different tree species that are adapted to those environments, the different livestock species, livestock classes. I got pictures from Alabama. A guy sent me, forester, conservation specialist, had a bull walking down, it was probably at least 4-inch diameter pine tree. Just want to scratch his belly and testicles, and that's kind of a hard thing to do for a tree to tolerate. So a calf's not going to do that. Mama cow's not going to do that. So we have to think about, again, all of the components of the system and how do I manage them? And what are their interactions likely to be? And so this person from Mississippi was saying intensive management is key to this system. And so, when we go to work with producers, if they're not already using rotational grazing methods, we're going to have to spend time talking to them about, getting them up to speed with something like that before we start talking about, adding trees into the system. And that said, some of these approaches don't have to be that challenging, perhaps. Again, this is an example of some pine trees we had at a research station where we had stockers in with them, and they did a little bit of damage to the trees, but nothing life-threatening. And over time, that stand will be just fine. If we had bulls or large animals, might be a different story. And so thinking about these dynamics is important. But it may be worth just sticking the trees in the ground and managing without a whole lot of protection in this context, rather than putting in a lot of fencing and having to work with that to protect the trees. Hardwood trees are a little more particular, and I think are a little more demanding perhaps in terms of protection. And you'll see a lot of people that use tubes. I mentioned Buck Holsinger earlier. Buck says, I don't want to fool with tubes anymore. I'll just kind of let weeds grow up and protect them. The cows don't seem to bother them as much with some of the weeds and stuff around them. But some people don't want to fool with that. This producer doing something very interesting. She uses a 6-foot tube with a fiberglass stake, and then she puts a hot wire across the tube so the cows can actually run or walk underneath this hot line. And if she wants to use it as a fence, she can lower it down on the tube. So she's integrated the tree protection with the fencing. And because she has a hot wire that runs down the tube, they don't push on that, use it as a scratching post or that sort of thing. I would encourage you, I should have included some examples from Georgia and Alabama. I would encourage you to take a picture of this web link. You can also find it on our Virginia Tech Silvopasture page. But if you go to this web link, you'll find something like 13 different producer stories of people doing silvopasture in Virginia, Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee. And this is, these are images that come out of the video for Win Miller there in Tennessee. And there's also a couple of additional videos that just talk about some of the producer challenges and some of the benefits that the producers are seeing. A number of people, I mentioned climate earlier in terms of temperature, a number of people, organizations are seeing silvopastures as a way to, in effect, offer a natural climate solution for climate change issues, drawing down carbon. There's a project or a group of people that call themselves Project Drawdown, and among the agricultural systems that can be deployed and management practices that can be deployed to improve carbon or remove carbon from the atmosphere, silvopasture is considered one of the best. And so there are a number of entities out there that are now working on these systems. And that's all I got. I'll stop there for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fike. So right now we're open for questions. I'm just gonna start with a couple that came while you were presenting, Dr. Fike. So while you're talking about, in one of your slides, you had some black walnut there. So
Yep.
Mr. Franklin is asking, black walnut has allelopathic properties. Is that a factor in the difference in forage production that you saw on your study?
It's really hard for us to tease that out because, well, it's hard to tease that out. When you start looking at allelopathy, it takes a lot of science is deeper than what I do to discern that. The question that's been in my mind is, do we see this as an allelopathic effect or is it a shade effect? The walnut trees are larger. They have a denser canopy. If you ever read Dr. Seuss, he talks about the truffula tree. If you know what a truffula tree is, I mean, they look like big pom-poms on stems sometimes. I mean, that's after we prune them. As they're growing out, they're getting bigger, more wider canopy. They're just casting more shade. So it could be somewhat of an allelopathic effect. It could be the shade effect. I tend to think it's a little bit of both. And my hypothesis would be that the allelopathy, it's not stopping us from having clover. In fact, we can see a fair amount of clover in these systems, but it probably slows the clover productivity down, as does the shade, quite frankly. And with less productive legumes, we have less nitrogen in the system, which means that our cool season forages are less productive. We're not doing, sort of differential fertilization from one system to another, trying to keep all of that the same. And so, I just think that our forages are not quite as productive in the system in part because legumes are less productive. Seemed like there's one other comment I was going to make relative to that, but well, one thing that I would say is with the walnut system, we can manage around that. We could have lower density walnuts, or we might intersperse, say, black locust that's got a smaller crown and it's going to put nitrogen back into the system. So there's an opportunity to have more diverse systems from the tree perspective. But when these studies were established 30 years ago almost, they just did a single species in each system.
Okay, thank you. So one other question that we have on the chat. So Mrs. Robertson is asking, she's sort of like building upon the previous question. So black locust is a legume. So do you think this helps with forage production, sort of what you're talking about?
Yeah, in fact, I probably should have shown you some other slides. I do think that it adds nitrogen into the system, and some of those earlier studies that I pointed to would indicate that as well. But I would say black locust, particularly, it can also serve as a forage resource. I have some images in some other presentations I didn't include today from the Holsinger farm, and he does what's called a hinge cut, because he wants a nice straight tree. Well, if it's got a branch here, he'll cut the top, and that branch will fall down, but it won't break all that cambium layer away from the bark, and so he can still get nutrients out to the leaf tissue. And over a summer, his cows will browse that a couple of times, and then when that finally is done, he'll just cut that limb off. And these are small diameter, so it's not a big chore, but he'll cut that limb off and let it fall to the ground, and they'll trample it in. It'll be a source of soil carbon, and it will also kind of help keep the cows away from the stem base a little bit, so there's less impact on the root systems. And we have some evidence. It's not not conclusive, but we have some evidence here from some other work that we're doing that tannins in forages can negate some of the effects of fescue toxins. And so his cattle are on essentially 100% toxic tall fescue. And he said they really relish these leaves with tannins in them, and particularly in the summertime when that stuff is actively growing.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is by Mr. Hermsen. So you mentioned that you have seen greater overall plant biomass productivity when integrating trees with forages. Has research been done evaluating the how a diverse forage stand affects biomass production versus a monoculture forage stand?
Yeah, so that's maybe a little bit outside the context of silvopasture per se, but the answer is yes, greater diversity in general is associated with higher productivity. You've got different root architectures, you have different phenology, so plants that are growing at different times and taking advantage of the resources. When you have a stress event and you have one species and it's sensitive to that stress, then the whole system is shut down. Whereas if you have multiple species with different sensitivities, let's say alfalfa or chicory with deep root systems can capture water when other forage species cannot. So to answer your question very briefly, yes, diversity is a good thing.
Okay. And then Dr. Halloran just mentioned that nitrogen fixation is especially beneficial for C3 forages at that time.
Well, it's beneficial for C4s as well, certainly. The C4s are more nitrogen use efficient, but if you looked at Bermuda grass or other C4 species, they like nitrogen. And they will be quite productive with it. I mean, we have a whole bunch of research just on how much and when to apply nitrogen fertilizers to Bermuda grass, hayfields, and pastures. So it's not just the C3s that like nitrogen.
Mm-hmm. Then we have one more question. So Mrs. Copterson is saying, I've read that honey locust doesn't fix as much nitrogen as black locust. Is that true?
What doesn't fix as much nitrogen as black locust?
Honey locust.
Oh, that probably is true. Honey locust is an intriguing plant. And I haven't read about this lately, but the last reading I did on this, there was some suggestion that it's a more primitive legume. It does not nodulate. And so, but it has high levels of nitrogen beyond what you might expect. And so, where's that nitrogen coming from? Are there microbial root associations that we're just not aware of? And again, I don't know where the research stands on that at this point, but yes, it does not nodulate, probably does not fix as much nitrogen. But one of the things we observe is that we have high levels of legume productivity oftentimes in our honey locust stands. So it will accommodate species like red clover. And so that's not been, I mean, we're looking at these systems primarily from their productivity, animal performance, forage production. We do look at some composition stuff. But we haven't gone deep into, nitrogen fixation by these different trees. But that does not, and we don't have a way to compare at this point, say black locust with honey locust. But you're generally right. I'd say that the honey locust we would anticipate would have lower levels of nitrogen fixation.
Okay, thank you. At this point, we're just gonna ask you if you have a question to unmute yourself and ask. Does anybody have any questions? Well,
so I got a question. Is this crazy? Does anybody want trees in pastures? And I realize I could have done a better job thinking about this in a South Carolina or Southern coastal plain context, but
no, you did a good job, Dr. Fike.
Well,
very useful information.
I see Mr. Noble, he kind of grinned when I said, this is crazy. And I'm not sure whether that's a grin of like, yeah, I'm not going to admit it out loud or what that means. But, I've spent a career on this essentially. Maybe I was crazy, but I think that it has real potential. The issue again is how do we get producers to manage?
And Dr. Fike, just before I let you go, I just wanted to ask you to touch a little more in a couple of topics, if you don't mind.
Oh, okay. I'll do my best.
So I know you have a lot of experience both on the working on research sites, but also helping producers to get their farms going and establishing their sites. So if you could just let us know some of the major considerations if I'm wanting to establish a silvopasture system that I should take in consideration.
Yeah, I was pulling slides from 2 or 3 different slide sets today, and Liliane, and I'm sorry, I had some stuff about considerations, and they didn't make it in, and that's just an oversight on my part. So, the first question is, what are your circumstances? What are your motivations? What are your goals? And I would say this too, for those of you who are producers who are thinking, well, this guy's nuts, but I could try some of this. One of my friends says, take the 10 tree challenge. Can you take a couple of species or whatever you think you're interested in and plant about 10 trees of them? Don't try to go out and plant 10 acres and watch the whole thing fail. Just go plant 10 trees and see if you can make them work or not. What works, what doesn't work. And think about your system. Are you in a deep sand? Are you on a red clay? Where are you going to be growing these trees? What trees are adapted to your site? What livestock are you trying to produce? I've got lots of people that want to do goats, and that's great. But if you're going to do goats, then you either need to think about a tree that they don't really have any particular preference for, Or you need to think about, well, I may need to be a little more aggressive at implementing protection, right? I mean, fencing might work, but I may even have to build put a cage around them, something like that. Honey, a quick story on honey locust trees. They were planted in 1995, and at the time they planted trees 8 feet apart. And every 5th tree was a grafted tree that produces a pod that's got lots of sugar in it. And my colleague that got me into this thing said the deer went to every one of those grafts and girdled the tree. The deer could tell that was a high sugar tree, and they left the common types alone. And so, you got to think about, is this tree going to be palatable or not? And if so, how do I protect it? If you're going back into a pasture system, you've got to think about reducing the competition there. So, some sort of herbicide treatment, or mulch, or both, that sort of thing. There are all these things that you want. Somebody said that this gave them some ideas for their pecans and loblollies. Yeah, and both very different types of trees are going to take different types of management. But the pecan silvopasture system is certainly doable, and you'll see in the Missouri, places like that, they're doing more black walnut, but the pecan systems are certainly possible. So again, I can't be prescriptive, but you just have to think about, how do these components go together and interact? And what am I willing to do? What do I have time and energy to do in terms of tree establishment? One thing, many of you may think about planting several acres, and you might have a commercial operator to do that. It's important, I think, to develop something of an aftercare program where they come back in, or you have somebody that's coming back in to look at those trees, see if they're healthy, living, kind of, if there's evidence of animal damage, you need to get on that quickly. And so, I mean, I kind of mixing pieces here. There's an aftercare part where, a commercial operator could come in and help keep those trees going, stake stuff if it needs to be, or remove weeds or that sort of thing. But then there's your job too, which would be to look at these on a regular basis and make sure that you're not suffering from wildlife damage, or that, you run the cattle in, make sure that the cattle are not causing problems. You don't want to just say, well, they'll be all right, and I'll take a look at them, next month, and by that time it's a problem. So, sorry, I'm not really answering the question. I'm saying you got to kind of work through some of those details on your own, for the resources you have, and the things, the outcomes that you want. I will say this as well. NRCS is highly supportive, I think, not in all states, but there seems to be a growing interest in seeing these systems get implemented. And you may or may not have I shouldn't say good, a knowledgeable technical service provider. But there are a lot of resources financially out there, and there's growing resources in terms of examples of how people are doing this successfully.
Sure, thank you. So Mr. Wade is asking, is there any research regarding using silvopasture and longleaf pine restoration?
I haven't seen that with longleaf pine. Restoration certainly would be possible, I think. The pines are, some people don't want to fool with longleaf because of, they're kind of variable coming out of the grass stage, and so it may take a little bit longer to get them up. But again, I think you could do that. You could certainly, and I don't know if I don't remember if it was longleaf or slash, or which species exactly, but I have some example imagery from somebody had given me. I think it was actually longleaf. So I think that's the bottom line is, I think that's very doable. It may take a different kind of time frame, or a different set of inputs than, say, if you're planting loblolly, which some of my forester friends tell me will grow in a parking lot.
Sure. So the next question is, any issues with soil pH adjacent to the trees?
Soil pH, what, Liliane?
Next to the trees. There, on the adjacent. My accent, John.
yeah, and
It's a
forgive me,
little
my ears
tricky.
don't always catch it exactly. So
I
so so
know.
so
Right
here,
next to the trees.
one of the things that it's been interesting to me. We plant trees and we've got different demonstration sites, and sometimes you got a site that looks kind of rough. For us, rough might be low pH, low phosphorus, and blackberries and that kind of stuff will show up there. But sometimes um, we get a lot of broom sedge. And so, I don't encourage you to improve the pasture before you get the tree planted if you're in that kind of situation, because those low pH systems or soil conditions are, oftentimes not very bad for many of the tree species that you might plant. And if you've got lots of broom sedge that's growing up around that tree, then that's a buffer. The deer don't want to put their head through that stuff, so that can be protective. Buck Holsinger, I've mentioned him 2 or 3 times. In his talk earlier this week, he said that he's now planting trees, black locust in particular, back into switchgrass fields. And he doesn't want to fool with tubes anymore. So that gives him some cover and protection for those seedling trees. But the switchgrass, the native grasses are well adapted to low soil pH. If you've got higher nutrient concentrations in soil, then you create environment or conditions that are more conducive for cool season or warm season forages for that matter. And that just means there's the potential for more competition. So if you don't have a high fertility site and you want to create silvopasture there, that's fine. Get the trees up and then, come back and do the renovation in the alleys or interspaces for your forage productions. Kind of that would be my general recommendation.
Sure. And the other point that I wanted to just maybe if you have some examples to mention something, is more like on the ecosystem benefits that we can get with silvopasture systems, because I think this is one of the things that a lot of people are looking to enhancing sustainability on their uh, farms nowadays. So, like, do you want to just mention
Right,
something?
right. Well, and I didn't want to step on Bruno's toes here, but I will just say that these systems offer the opportunity to capture carbon, to support greater biodiversity within the soil. When we get out and work within the silvopasture, and I have graduate students out there working, in these systems, and they're like, "We'll work in the silvopasture. You can do the stuff out in the open." There's a benefit to the human being interacting in that space, quite frankly. And I know people that are like, if I can manage in these systems, that's fantastic. And of course, maybe where you are, grassland birds are a real issue. And so, I don't say we have to put silvopasture on every acre, because grassland birds need open sites. They don't need trees around them. But we, at the same time, we do see lots of bird species that we wouldn't see in our open systems. And our lands are kind of cut up. They're not necessarily the best suited for grassland birds, at least where I'm doing some of my research. So I don't feel like I'm hurting them, but I'm providing opportunity for other species. Yeah, so I mentioned carbon. It's possible that those healthier and more comfortable animals are producing a better quality product. We haven't measured that at this point. And there may even be the potential benefits relative to sometimes when animals are more heat stressed. I think they can have higher methane emissions. So, we don't have all the data to say one way or another on that. But we do think of those as potential benefits. Certainly, we have a lot of historically have done a lot of riparian buffer plantings with trees. And so in this kind of context, silvopasture may be, a way to manage a riparian buffer. If those trees are out in leaf and you've got a big storm coming, you are going to slow those raindrops, and you can slow runoff to the ecosystem. And two, if you get into a big bad drought, I mean, I'm older than most of you here. I remember in '93 there was, excuse me, '93 was a big flood in the Midwest. There was a big drought in the early '90s, I think. And there used to be a lot of news stories at that time of producers that were cutting sycamore and poplar and cottonwood and things like that to feed their cattle. So a lot of these trees, can buffer the system from a temperature, from a moisture standpoint, but they also can buffer the system in terms of feed resources when you get into extreme weather. I didn't talk so much about cold. It's not something we worry about much in the Southeast, but there's a lot of energy lost by animals, that are out in an open field dealing with cold temperatures and wet weather and wind. And so you could plant trees, not maybe so much as silvopasture, but as shelter belts, to give them some protection from the elements that way. And that has a very high energy sparing effect.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Fike. We really appreciate all the information that you shared with us.